April 10, 1951. Blair House, Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman sits in his study, shirt sleeves rolled up, reading casualty reports from Korea. It's 11 at night. He's been awake for 16 hours. The lamp on his desk casts long shadows across the room. Then there's a knock. Urgent. General Omar Bradley steps inside, and he's not carrying a classified cable. He's carrying a newspaper. Truman looks up. Bradley hands him the Chicago Tribune. Truman reads the headline. His jaw tightens. He reads it again. Then he sets the paper down slowly, very slowly, and speaks just one sentence. He's done it now. America's most decorated General 5 Stars, Medal of Honor recipient, Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, the man who accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, has just publicly demanded that the President of the United States start World War III. And he didn't send a cable. He didn't request a meeting. He did it in a letter to a Republican congressman. And now it's in the Chicago Tribune. This is the story of what happened when President Truman drew the line, when he fired Douglas MacArthur, when he ended a 52-year military career in 24 hours, and when he proved that in America, even 5-star generals answer to the Constitution. Before we go any further, if you're fascinated by untold moments in history where leadership, duty, and principle collide, make sure to subscribe to Elite War Files, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us which historical confrontation you want us to cover next. We bring you the real stories behind the moments that shaped the world. Now, let's get back to that night in Blair House. Truman stares at the newspaper. The letter is from General Douglas MacArthur to Republican Congressman Joseph Martin, House Minority Leader. Martin had written MacArthur asking for his views on using nationalist Chinese forces to open a second front against Communist China. MacArthur's response is blunt. He advocates for exactly that. He calls for bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria. He calls for expanding the war beyond Korea, and then he writes the line that seals his fate. There is no substitute for victory. Bradley watches Truman read. Finally, Truman speaks. Read this section again. Bradley leans in. There is no substitute for victory. Sir, he's saying your policy is defeatist. In a newspaper. Not through channels. Not to me directly. In the goddamn Tribune. Truman pauses. How many times is this? This is the 6th public statement contradicting policy, sir. 6 times. Truman's voice is quiet. Dangerously quiet. And he thinks I won't do anything because he's Douglas MacArthur. But here's the thing. Truman had been watching MacArthur for months, and he'd been counting. Let me show you what MacArthur is proposing. China has 1.2 million troops positioned in Manchuria, just across the Yalu River. MacArthur wants to bomb more than 20 airfields on Chinese soil. That's not Korean territory. That's China. Now, the Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty with China on February 14, 1950. Article 1 of that treaty states that if China is attacked, the Soviets can intervene. That's not just a regional conflict anymore. That's World War III with nuclear weapons. And MacArthur is advocating for this publicly, in direct contradiction of presidential orders. Truman sets the newspaper on his desk. He looks at Bradley. How many times did I tell him to clear public statements through State and Defense? December 6, sir. Official presidential directive. December 6. Truman nods slowly. And this letter is dated March 20th. He knew it would be made public. He wanted it to be. Bradley doesn't respond. There's nothing to say. Get me his file, Truman says. Every statement, every press conference, every cable. I want it all documented. Yes, sir. And Bradley? Truman's voice is cold now. Start thinking about who replaces him. But this didn't start with the Martin letter. This started 6 months earlier, on a remote airfield in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, October 15, 1950. Wake Island. The most powerful man in the world is about to meet the most famous general in the world, and neither one of them is happy about it. Truman flew 4,700 miles to get here. That's Washington to Hawaii, then Hawaii to Wake Island. It's a 14-hour flight in a propeller-driven aircraft. He's tired. He's irritated. And he's here because Douglas MacArthur refused to come to Washington, said he couldn't leave his command. So Truman came to him. MacArthur's plane lands. He steps out onto the tarmac. Truman is waiting. And here's the first sign of what's coming. MacArthur doesn't salute, doesn't stand at attention. He walks up to the President of the United States and shakes his hand, like they're equals, not commander-in-chief and subordinate. Equals. They walk to the terminal building. Truman wastes no time. General, what are the chances of Chinese or Soviet intervention? MacArthur doesn't hesitate. Very little, Mr. Rawson. President, had they interfered in the first or second month, it would have been decisive. We are no longer fearful of their intervention. What if they do cross the Yalu? MacArthur smiles. Then there would be the greatest slaughter. He pauses for effect. The Chinese have no air force. If they tried to advance to Pyongyang, there would be the greatest slaughter. Truman studies him. You're certain? Mr. Fox, President, the war will be over by Thanksgiving. You can have one division home by Christmas. Truman wants to believe him. MacArthur has never lost. He island hopped across the Pacific. He retook the Philippines. He accepted Japan's surrender. He rebuilt Japan into a democracy. He's a legend, and he's sitting here telling the president that China won't intervene. But there's something in MacArthur's tone, something dismissive, something that sounds less like military analysis and more like arrogance. At the end of the meeting, Truman tries one more time, quietly, almost gently. General, I hope you understand. I have to consider the global situation. This isn't just about Korea. MacArthur's response is immediate. Cold. Of course, Mr. President, but here's where the war is being fought. Here is where it must be won. The meeting ends, and here's what happens next. MacArthur doesn't stay for lunch, doesn't wait for Truman's plane to take off first. He boards his plane and leaves. Immediately. Truman watches the plane disappear into the Pacific sky. He turns to an aide and says 4 words. He's a supreme egotist. 2 weeks later, 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River. MacArthur's forces, overextended, split into separate columns, advancing toward the Chinese border, are caught completely off guard. Within days, the Eighth Army is in full retreat. By December, it's the longest retreat in United States military history. Thousands of American soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. The war MacArthur promised would be over by Thanksgiving has become a nightmare. And MacArthur blames Washington. Publicly. Now the pattern starts. August 28, 1950. Pentagon. Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson is on a secure line to Tokyo. MacArthur has just released a statement to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention criticizing the administration's policy on Taiwan. He calls defending Formosa a military necessity. This directly contradicts the State Department's position. Truman is livid. He orders Johnson to have MacArthur withdraw the statement. General, the President wants that VFW statement withdrawn. There's a pause on the line. Then MacArthur's voice, smooth and unconcerned. I'm surprised it caused concern. It was simply military analysis. It contradicts policy, Doug. I can only assume someone wants to appease the Chinese. Johnson exhales slowly. He's known MacArthur for years. He knows how this works. The president wants it withdrawn. Very well. MacArthur withdraws the statement. But it doesn't matter. Every newspaper in America has already printed it. The damage is done, and MacArthur knows it. December 1st, 1950. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are in conference at the Pentagon. A cable has just arrived from Tokyo. MacArthur's cable reads, "We face an entirely new war. The Chinese have committed their full military potential. I am being asked to fight a limited war against unlimited aggression." General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, reads it aloud. Then he looks up. He's blaming us for the Chinese intervention. Admiral Forrest Sherman shakes his head. He told Truman they wouldn't intervene at all. General Bradley leans back in his chair. And now he wants to expand the war to fix his mistake. The room is silent. Everyone knows what this means. MacArthur isn't just disagreeing with policy, he's waging a public relations campaign against his own commander-in-chief. Then, in mid-December, MacArthur holds a press conference in Tokyo. He tells reporters, "I am fighting a war with one hand tied behind my back. If I had been given permission to strike the enemy's bases beyond the Yalu, we would not be in this situation." The interview runs in Life magazine. The headline reads, "MacArthur, I could have won." December 6, 1950. Truman is in the Oval Office reading Life magazine. His press secretary, Joe Short, is standing nearby. Truman closes the magazine, looks up. Issue the directive. Every military officer clears public policy statements through state and defense. Everyone, including MacArthur. Sir, he's not going to like. I don't care what he likes. Issue it. The directive goes out. Presidential Order, December 6, 1950. All military personnel must clear public statements on policy through the State Department and the Department of Defense before release. It's direct. It's unambiguous, and MacArthur ignores it. But MacArthur wasn't done. What he said next would bring the Joint Chiefs to Truman's office at midnight, March 24, 1951. Washington, D.C. Truman has been working on something, a peace initiative. The State Department has drafted a ceasefire proposal. The United Nations allies are on board. And through diplomatic back channels, China has indicated they might be willing to negotiate. It's delicate, it's fragile, and it could end the war. Then, At 2 o'clock in the morning Washington time, an aide wakes General Bradley. "Sir, MacArthur just issued an ultimatum to China." Bradley sits up. "What? On whose authority?" "His own, sir. MacArthur has released a public statement. Not a recommendation, not a proposal. An ultimatum, directed at the Chinese commander, threatening to expand the war to Chinese coastal areas and interior bases unless they surrender. Here's what he said. The enemy must by now be painfully aware that a decision of the United Nations to depart from its tolerant effort to contain the war to the area of Korea through an expansion of our military operations to his coastal areas and interior bases would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse. By morning, the State Department is in chaos. Secretary of State Dean Acheson arrives at the White House. "Mr. President, MacArthur has sabotaged the peace initiative. The Chinese will never negotiate now. He's threatening them publicly." Truman's face is stone. "Get me Bradley, Marshall, Acheson, and Harriman. Tonight." That same day, cables start arriving from America's allies. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee. The general seems to be conducting his own foreign policy. Senator Robert Taft, Republican, issues a statement defending MacArthur. General MacArthur has every right to state his military views. From Beijing, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai responds, "This proves American imperialism will never negotiate in good faith." And then, in March 1951, MacArthur made the move that even his defenders couldn't explain. March 20, 1951. Republican Congressman Joseph Martin writes MacArthur a letter. He asks whether MacArthur agrees that nationalist Chinese forces should be used to open a second front against communist China. Martin knows what he's doing. He's baiting MacArthur, and MacArthur takes the bait. MacArthur writes back. In the letter, he advocates for exactly what Martin suggested: use Chiang Kai-shek's forces, bomb Manchuria, expand the war, and then he writes the line that ends his career: "There is no substitute for victory." Martin reads the letter to the House of Representatives on April 5, 1951. It's front-page news within hours. And that brings us back to Blair House. April 10th, 11 p.m. Truman reading the Chicago Tribune. What Truman read in that letter would end a 52-year military career in 24 hours. Late night, March 24th, the White House. Truman sits at the head of the table. General Bradley, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, Special Assistant to the President. No one speaks at first. Finally, Truman breaks the silence. "Gentlemen, I've been patient. I've issued directives. I've sent messages through channels." He ignores them all. Marshall, the elder statesman, the man who planned D-Day, speaks carefully. "Mr. President, the constitutional principle is clear: civilian control of the military." "I know the principle, George." Truman's voice is tight. "The question is timing. If I fire him now, what happens?" Harriman doesn't hesitate. "Political firestorm. He's a war hero. Republicans will call it partisan. They'll say you're soft on communism." Acheson leans forward. "But if you don't fire him, Mr. President, what's to stop him from starting World War III on his own authority?" The room goes silent. Everyone knows Acheson is right. Truman looks around the table. "Keep documenting. Every statement, every cable, every violation. When I do this, it has to be airtight. I need the Joint Chiefs' support. All of them." In his diary that night, Truman writes, "I've been thinking about MacArthur. He's got to go. He's insubordinate. He's reckless. And he doesn't give a damn about the Constitution." April 11, 1951. 1 a.m. Blair House. Truman has called the Joint Chiefs to a meeting. This isn't protocol. This is the middle of the night. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. General J. Pradley, Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff. They sit around the table. Truman doesn't waste time. "Gentlemen, I'm going to relieve General MacArthur of command. I need to know if the Joint Chiefs concur." Silence. This is the moment. These men have served with MacArthur. They respect him, but they also know what's at stake. General Bradley speaks first. "Mr. President, we've reviewed his public statements. All 6 major violations of the December 6th directive. The Martin letter is the final straw." "Will removing him damage military operations in Korea?" Truman asks. General Collins answers. "General Matthew Ridgway can take command immediately, sir. Operations will not be affected. He's already in theater. He knows the situation." Admiral Sherman leans forward. "Sir, if I may, this is about more than Korea. This is about who commands the military." "Exactly," Truman says. General Vandenberg nods. "The Air Force concurs with relief, Mr. B. Sy." "President," Bradley takes a breath. "This is the weight of it. Mr. Cuppin, President, we've discussed this among ourselves. All of us. We all agree. From a military standpoint, MacArthur's removal is not only justified, it's necessary. Truman looks at each man. Then he nods. Then, it's settled. Draft the orders. April 11th, 1951, 10 a.m. Truman signs the order. It's short, direct, and it ends the career of the most famous general in America. I deeply regret that it becomes my duty as President and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Military Forces to replace you as Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief, Far East, and Commanding General, U.S. Army, Far East. But then comes the paragraph that defines the moment, the paragraph that every military officer studies today. Full and vigorous debate on matters of national policy is a vital element in the constitutional system of our free democracy. It is fundamental, however, that military commanders must be governed by the policies and directives issued to them in the manner provided by our laws and Constitution. In time of crisis, this consideration is particularly compelling. This isn't just a termination letter. This is a constitutional declaration. Truman is stating, for the record, that the military does not make policy, elected leaders do. And generals, even 5-star generals with medals of honor, follow orders, or they're relieved. Tokyo, April 11th, 1951. MacArthur is at a luncheon. The room is filled with diplomats, Japanese officials, military officers. Then an aide rushes in. He whispers to another officer. The officer turns on a radio. CBS is broadcasting breaking news. MacArthur learns he's been fired by listening to the radio. The official cable hasn't even arrived yet. Jean MacArthur, his wife, is sitting beside him. She hears it first. She turns to him, her face pale. "Douglas, you've been relieved." MacArthur sits very still. The room has gone silent. Everyone is watching him. Finally, he speaks. His voice is quiet. "Jeannie, we're finally going home." And just like that, 52 years of military service end. Not on a battlefield, not in a ceremony, in a radio broadcast. MacArthur returned to the United States on April 17, 1951. He hadn't set foot in America in 14 years. And when he arrived, the reception was overwhelming. 7.5 million people lined the streets of San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C. They cheered. They waved flags. To many Americans, MacArthur was a hero, being persecuted by politicians. April 19, 1951. MacArthur addresses a joint session of Congress. 650 million people around the world listen on radio. He speaks for 34 minutes. He defends his record. He criticizes the policy of limited war. And then he closes with the line that becomes legendary. "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." The chamber erupts in applause. Grown men weep. Republicans stand and cheer. For a moment, it seems like Truman made a catastrophic mistake. But then the hearings begin. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee launch an investigation. 8 weeks. Testimony from MacArthur, the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of State Atchison, Secretary of Defense Marshall. And slowly, the facts come out. MacArthur testifies for 3 days. May 3rd, 4, and 5, 1951. Senators questioned him about Wake Island, about the Chinese intervention he said would never happen, about the public statements contradicting policy, about the March 24th ultimatum that destroyed peace talks. And MacArthur's answers start to sound less like strategic wisdom and more like insubordination. Then General Omar Bradley testifies, and he says the line that changes everything: Red China is not the powerful nation seeking to dominate the world. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. The wrong war. The wrong place. The wrong time. The wrong enemy. That's the Joint Chiefs of Staff, MacArthur's fellow generals, saying his strategy would have been a disaster. The numbers tell the story. Truman's approval rating drops to 23%, the lowest ever recorded at that time. But the military stands with him. All 5 Joint Chiefs support the decision. The facts support the decision. And slowly, public opinion begins to shift. Because this wasn't about Korea. It wasn't even about MacArthur. This was about the Constitution. About civilian control of the military, about whether a general can override the president because he thinks he knows better. Years later, Truman was asked if he had any regrets about firing MacArthur. His answer was immediate. None. "I did what the Constitution required. If generals make policy, then we don't have a democracy." Even Dwight Eisenhower, MacArthur's former subordinate, supported Truman's decision. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote, "When you put on a uniform, there are certain inhibitions you accept. One is that you do not talk politics. Another is that you obey orders." MacArthur forgot both. MacArthur faded. Exactly as he said he would. He ran for president in 1952, got nowhere. He gave speeches, wrote memoirs, attended ceremonies, but he never commanded troops again, never shaped policy again. He lived until 1964, but his influence ended on April 11, 1951. Truman left office in 1953, with the lowest approval ratings in modern history. He didn't run for re-election, but history vindicated him. Today, every officer at West Point, Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy studies the MacArthur firing. Not as a political case study, as a lesson in constitutional duty. April 11, 1951. The day a haberdasher from Missouri told a five-star general and the world that in America, the Constitution outranks even heroes. The day a president sacrificed his political career to defend a principle. And the day Douglas MacArthur learned that there are no exceptions to civilian control of the military. Not for legends, not for war heroes, not for anyone. If this story gave you a new perspective on leadership, duty, and the Constitution, do us a favor. Subscribe to Elite War Files, smash that like button, and let us know in the comments what other pivotal moments in history you want us to uncover. We're here to bring you the untold stories that shaped the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.